Yeah, okay. So we have Matthew here. Good morning, Matt.
Hi, good morning.
Okay, thank you very much for being here with us today. It's such an honor for us for having you here as our guest lecturer. Okay. So, well, everyone, I will a little bit introduce Matthew. Yeah, so Matthew is an assistant professor, yeah, for digital literacies for multilingual students in the Department of Teaching and Learning at the University of Miami. Yeah. Okay, so today we will have two sessions. The first one, 50 minutes presentation from Matthew, and then the next one, 35 minutes for question and answer session. Okay, without further ado, time is yours. Matthew, please.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Again, welcome. It's so good to be here and to share in this time of learning together. I have prepared materials on a PowerPoint, and sometimes I will show the PowerPoint, and then sometimes I will just close the PowerPoint so that I can talk to you directly and you don't necessarily see my screen. So the topic for tonight is examining literacy challenges in the 21st century. And this is an area of my teaching and an area of my research. And it's something that I feel is an important topic to consider because, as we know, there have been many changes in the last 20 years, especially with the advent of the smartphone and with tablets, with the internet. The way that we engage in literate practices has changed a lot. So I want to give an overview for tonight. I will begin with some personal introductions. And then I think it is always good to start with, what do we already know? If we think about our students, they enter into our classroom spaces with a lot of family knowledge, a lot of community knowledge, a lot of knowledge from following their religion. They come into our classrooms with their hobbies and their talents. And so I think it is always important to build on what is already present, what we already know about our students. We will then spend some time talking a little bit about the limits of communicative language teaching and the digital age. I'll introduce the New London group and how these scholars from 1996 onward have challenged us to think about digital literacies. Then we'll talk a little bit about how this factors into assessment and standards. And we can also end our time with a focus on the importance of critical media literacy. As we know, in this day and age, there's much misinformation or disinformation. And so we have to help our students to be able to see the messages that they read and to determine whether or not the sources that they're finding on the internet or on social media are credible and reliable, because we know that disinformation can cause a lot of trouble in the society. So again, I just want to say thank you to everyone for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. And we will get started by me sharing a little bit about my family and my own journey. So I am very active on Twitter, which is where you can see the little bird in the corner. I think Twitter is a great way to engage in digital literacies, but perhaps maybe you're less interested in Twitter and more interested in my family. So I have two daughters and my wife, and my daughter in the blue is Madeline, in the light blue, and then my daughter in the gray is Katrina. Madeline and I share a birthday, which I think is very exciting. To share a birthday with your daughter is a fun thing. And we are a family of four, and we have lived in Miami for now 4 years. This is the start of our fourth year. I first met Dion at Michigan State, which is where I went to graduate school. So I've only lived in Florida for a little bit of time. So I was born in California in the western part of the United States, and I grew up in the Great Lakes region in Michigan, and I spent 10 years living in China. And I think it's very important to share this with you because, as I said before, so much of our learning is shaped by our lived experience. And so it was the 10 years of living in China that I came to understand a different culture and a different language and a different way of interacting with people in the broader society. It is a time that I became fluent in an additional language. Even though I studied French in high school, I did not always understand French. And so I feel like my time living in China really helped me to learn more about languages. I am a former high school English teacher. I taught English literature and poetry for 3 years. And then for 10 years, I was in China as an English language teacher. And I think this is important because each of us in a global society are trying to navigate about different cultures and different contexts. And so I think that this is something that I bring with me to my students in my teaching is what are ways that we can understand culture and how is language connected to culture, and how do the ways that we interact with other people, are they informed by the values of our society? My master's degree was actually in intercultural relations. So I was studying, the different ways that different cultures act and react and get along with one another. I studied about growth and development for different, like from the United Nations. And I speak Chinese, and I am also receptive in French. So this is a little bit about me, and this is what I bring into the learning space tonight. So I know that we have the chat feature on Zoom, and I think that this is a good opportunity for us to collectively, as a 3-in-1 program, share some of the things that we already understand. So in the PowerPoint slide, there are kind of 2 guiding questions at the top. What do you already know about the challenges of 21st century literacy? And as I noted earlier, I lived in China, and that time in China, the globalization of these world markets has also shaped some of my understanding. So if you would like, feel free to add in the chat some of your ideas about the challenges of digital literacies in the 21st century. And then I can talk about some of the things you put in the chat. So I had noted one challenge is about media literacy and disinformation. Conversely, you could also put in the chat some of the ways that you participate in digital literacy. So maybe you're active on Twitter or Facebook or something like this, right? So if you want, you're more than welcome to share your ideas in the chat. But if this is less comfortable for you, I just want to model the importance of we should try to build on our already present understanding. So if anyone wants to add to the chat, you're welcome to do that. But if you're less comfortable, that's okay as well. Hopefully one of the goals tonight is that we can think about how we design curriculum with a focus on these digital literacy skills. So I'm going to begin with just a couple comments about communicative language teaching. In the field of TESOL, this has been one of the most recent theories that has guided teaching practice. And this approach to second language acquisition, it talks about how we can support students in real life learning tasks. So maybe, coordinating a schedule, or engaging at the local marketplace, or going to the bank and doing a transaction. And so maybe you do a role play, or students pretend they're at a restaurant and they order food. And I think that communicative language teaching is a very social way of learning language, right? Students aren't just memorizing grammar patterns. Students have a chance to act and interact. But one of the limitations of this approach is that it kind of presupposes this interpersonal interactions. But now the engagements are digital, so they're very different, and they require different demands. So we can still do communicative language teaching in our classroom, But when we think about register, or we think about like registers, you know, the level of honor in our speech or who we're addressing. When we think about pragmatics, these are, you know, different things online. So when we're composing an email, it's very different than if we're talking to someone face to face. When we're composing an email versus composing a tweet. So these different audiences and these different modes of communication change the way that we use language. And so in the digital era, some of the former ways of just talking are much different, because in digital literacies, or in the current literacy landscape, we have gesture, we have audio, we have visual, we have signs, we have symbols, we have sometimes sound effects. So all of these things create a different communicative environment, right? And then also sometimes when we think about communicative language teaching, it doesn't always allow for criticality. So we might be talking about going to the bank and we might say, you know, I need to take out some money. But communicative language teaching doesn't often address some of the bigger challenges, right? So a unit on banking might not talk about economic policy, or might not talk about poverty, right? And these are real conditions that people in the society are facing. And so sometimes when we engage in digital literacies, we're able to bring an additional critical lens to kind of understand what are the different things that are informing the topic at hand. So we don't just overlook, you know, going to the bank and getting money out is different than the bank crashes and the government must bail out the bank, right? Which happened in the US. So these are all different considerations that we can have in the realm of TESOL, in the realm of communicative language teaching as a part of second language acquisition. And so I'm just going to talk about, these are some of the ideas that I want you to consider, right? What are ways that you're already bringing digital literacies into your teaching? So are you using assignments for students that engage them to use something other than just print, something other than just pencil and paper? How are you in your teaching bringing in the students' lives on their phones, bringing in the lives on their computers? And then one of the things that also we should consider is this notion that in the digital era, things travel, right? So if we go back in time, maybe 40 years, we could not have this meeting in this format. I maybe would have to take a long trip to Indonesia, right? Or maybe I could mail a whole bunch of handouts and materials to Indonesia, and then you could receive the handouts, right? But all of these changes, now we have much fluidity across these practices. And so when we think about our students in schools, we must also consider, how do their digital literacies move from their home environment to the community environment to the classroom environment? Because this is an age where there's a lot of transfer in between. And then it's really important as educators that we might take stock, or we might think about, what are our students doing in school or out of school? How do they use their phones? How do they use digital literacies? How are they actively engaging in these practices that we can then use in the context of our classroom, right? So maybe you walk into a classroom and you would have a hard time guessing, what year is it? Is it 1970? Is it 1980? Classrooms, at least in America, look very similar to how they looked 20 and 30 years ago. The only difference is that now there might be a computer or a projector that can project the computer in the classroom. But most teachers still use textbooks. They still use handouts. They don't teach in the same way that their students are learning every day from their digital devices. So these are important considerations that we should have when we think about working with our students in schools. How are they doing digital literacies? And then what skills can I teach them to support them? Now, there are some differences between traditional literacies and digital literacies. And so we will look at some of these differences. So the New London Group was a group of scholars. They were 10 academics who met in the United States in the town of New London, New Hampshire. And they wanted to develop a new pedagogy for literacy that would face the concerns that they had at the time. Now, if you think about 1996, this is really before the internet was very large, before email. It was certainly before cell phones. But these scholars looked out and they said, you know, the world around us is changing very quickly with video, with audio, with movies, with music. And we need to do better to consider what are literacy practices that are informed by these different design elements. So if you look at the circle, you can see that it is multimodal, right? So multi means many, and mode is a form of representation. So on the Zoom call tonight, we have audio, we have video, we have the chat feature. It's being recorded right now. I'm using my gestures, like my hand to talk. All of these are different modes of meaning making. Now, if I were to mute myself, we lost a mode of communication, right? So you can see me gesturing and you can see me doing this, but you can't hear what I'm saying. But you can still read the PowerPoint slide. And, you know, so different modes help us to make meaning, right? Now, let's say if I did something different, I'm going to stop my video, but I'm still going to have my audio. So now you can't see me gesture. You can't see if I'm smiling or frowning or crying. You can just hear my voice. So every mode adds a support for the meaning. And when we think about different modes, they all have affordances, things that help us out, and constraints. So when I turned off my sound, you could only see me, you could not hear me. Now I turned off my video, you can hear me, but you cannot see me. So when we put all of these modes together, it gives us a better chance to make the meaning together. So when we think about modes of learning, we can think about audio design, visual design, gestures, and space, right? So even on Zoom, if you think about Zoom, we've spent a lot of time on Zoom under this pandemic. But if you go to the edge of your screen, this is only the space that I'm capturing. So if I turn the camera, you can see more, right? So there's spatial design that frames what we're doing, right? And so it changes for us the sense of meaning making. So when we think about digital literacies, where is the camera? Where is the microphone? Does it allow me to capture my gestures, right? All of these things. If I put my hands and I'm talking down here, but my hands are not in the picture, then you can't see the gestures that I'm doing, right? Maybe I say to students, there are 3 things to remember: the first, the second, the third. Right now in the spatial design, you can see me. But if I say now, there are 4 things, 1, 2, 3, 4, you lost my fingers because they were out of the field of the camera. So all of these things together help us to make meaning, right? So there's things like gesture, shape, color, sound, music, foreground, background. And we students already know a lot of this on their own, but sometimes we need to point their attention to all of the different ways that these modes help us to understand and to make meaning. So the New London group is really the group most responsible in the last 26 years for shifting focus to digital and multi-literacies, right? Many literacies. Okay, so this comes from a book called What is Literacy 2.0? And it talks about some of the traditional print-based versus digital environments. So when we look at this slide, you know, maybe generally, if you're reading a book, you can go to the table of contents, right? What is the introduction? What is the first chapter? What is at the back, the glossary? And all of us know if we pick up a book, we would find the table of contents in the front. But when you're on a web page, there's not a table of contents. When you're on a web page, you're going hyperlinks and in and out of different things. So traditional literacies have a roadmap at the start of the book. But when we navigate web pages, there's not necessarily a table of contents for the web pages. There's a landing page. There's all kinds of different stuff, right? Often in books, we read top to bottom. In English, we read left to right, right? So all of this is a traditional format, but in digital formats, we don't always read top to bottom. Sometimes we can read different parts on one whole web page. Or if we think about Instagram, when we read Instagram, we scroll, or Twitter, we scroll, right? So scrolling is a very different thing than flipping the pages of a book, right? When you flip a page of a book, you're kind of reading like linearly rather than more vertically. Almost all of our digital media, we're doing vertical reading rather than like linear horizontal reading. I mean, we're still reading left to right, but we often are reading top to bottom, right? We can also zoom in and zoom out. We can click on words and maybe it gives us a definition. So all of these, and I can share the PowerPoint with you, but these are all of the differences that we have between digital literacies and traditional print, right? So sometimes, let's say you're going to teach your students a story or a poem. The entire poem or story is there, it's contained. So you can pre-teach vocabulary, you can pre-teach the form of the poem. But let's say you go to an online environment. There's no way that you could preview all of the online content. So traditional literacy has skills that our students master, but digital literacies have different things that students must understand and know how to use. They need to know how hyperlinks work. They need to know how to click on images. If there's a video, they need to know where's the sound, where's the microphone. All of these are different skills that our students will have to do in the 21st century. Now, most of these skills are intuitive. They're happening because our devices in many ways teach us how to do this. But we should still make it explicit for students how these skills are different from print and from text on a page to the digital realm. So then I think a good question to ask is, how do you draw on technology in your learning? What are some things that you're already bringing into your classroom space? Do you teach students using more than a textbook or using more than a handout? Maybe you could take an inventory of all of the different ways that you use technology in a lesson during the week of school. And then the next thing is, often if we don't plan or design the instruction, then it doesn't happen. So how can we make choices in design of the lesson plan or the curricula or the teaching materials that welcome technology into the classroom space, right? Maybe you're going to show a video, and then after you show the video, you have students go online and read a review of the video. Then maybe later you have them write their own critique of the video and say you could do this as a blog post, right? So we have all of these different forms. We have audio, we have visual, we have writing, we have blogging, and they can all work together to support the students. All right, but in order to do this well, we must also consider some of the educational or pedagogical outcomes of digital literacy, right? So if we think about intentional design from the start, if we want students to have the skills that we listed here, we need to make sure, how are we pre-teaching audio design? Do they understand the role of sound effects? So maybe for students, we're teaching a lesson on emotion, right? And we want them to understand emotion, right? So feelings of joy or feelings of happiness or feelings of fear. Maybe we play for students a clip from a movie and you play without the sound and you say, there's no sound here. What did the visual image do for emotion, right? Then you could play a clip with the sound and say, how does the music, how does the rising of the score when the person is winning make you feel a strong emotion, right? Maybe you play a scene where someone is very sad and the music is very quiet. Or we can also think about the role of sound in an image. Let's say they're watching a horror film, right? So what are the noises in a scary movie, right? Do you hear the creak of the door? Maybe the monster is coming and there's dun, 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 right? all of these things are working together to give emotion. So if you play the video with no sound or analyze the sound, then they can talk about what is the role of music in shaping emotion in the films that we watch, right? One of my favorite things is animation. And the Pixar is a Disney company, and they have made a number of different shorts. These are last maybe 5 to 7 minutes. And one of the most recent ones was 2 older people who are living in a city, and they used to be dancers. And they go outside and it starts raining and they become young again. And they become youthful and they dance and they run around the city. And then the rain moves away and they become old again. This Pixar short, it has no spoken words. There's no English, there's no Indonesian, there's no Chinese, there's no French. The whole story is told just through the music. So then you can have students analyze, what is the role of music in shaping this? And so they would watch a video and listen, and then they could speak back and say how emotion was portrayed through music in the animated short, and describe how the different scenes made them feel and react as a part of the process, right? Or you could ask students to describe a task and say you cannot use any gestures. You must just talk about it, right? And then you'd say, okay, I want you to do the task, but we're going to do some, total physical response, right? So brush the teeth or comb the hair or put on the makeup, right? We know that when we add these gestures, comb the hair, brush the teeth, put on the makeup, it helps students to take the action with the vocabulary and to learn it better, right? So these are all different ways that you could help your students to draw attention to the way that they do it. So I think that is important. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions. But for now, I will just keep on talking. So I thank you for the different things that you're putting into the chat. Okay, so I have a whole list here of different digital literacies. And what I want us to do is to think about what are some of the demands for literacy. So for example, if you are in a chat room and you want to be effective, right? You have to know some certain things. So even for Zoom, let's take the Zoom chat, for example, right? So we all have the chat open, or maybe you don't have it open. So first, we would need to say, where can I go to access the chat, right? And then on Zoom, we have the little chat bubble, right? So this bubble that says chat is like a speech bubble. It's a sign that suggests to us typing, right? Because the chat here is not talking. The speech bubble is not our thoughts. The chat is us writing down, right? So even on a Zoom call, you would have to know, where can I find the chat button? Do I click on the chat button? It launches, right? Then in Zoom, we have 2 features. You can choose for everyone, or you can choose to send a private message to someone, right? So let's say I want to talk to my colleague, but I don't want everyone to know. Then I would have to teach my students, this has a private chat feature. We can also talk about what is the difference between public and private, right? Maybe you would say, Matthew, he's so boring. I do not like this 3-in-1 program, right? You would maybe say that privately, but if you put that to everyone, then you'll feel very embarrassed because everyone will know the thought that you meant for someone else, right? So for our students, we would want to show them, if this is going to everyone, or is this going to a specific audience, right? So even in a chat room, we have to think about audience. We have to think about tone. We have to think about message. And if you look at the chat, you need to know that the chat is sequential, that there is a timestamp. So let's say the session goes for 3 hours. Oh, they said something back in the first hour. So then maybe you scroll and say, oh, that's right, at 8:10 p.m., right? Or someone says to you, please, go back to the posting 4 days ago. So then you have to know how to click back and what will take you back to the chat from 4 days ago, right? So these are all of the different demands that we might have in a chat room, right? Cloud computing. Many of you maybe use Google Drive, or you use Microsoft Teams, right? So when we think about the cloud computing, if I'm writing on a manuscript, right, then I can share ideas. So cloud computing is a really good way to share ideas together. So I'm going to give you an example of something that I do with my own students, right? So when I'm working with my students, I have them write like reflective reading logs, right? And so in a reflective reading log, my students share ideas. So let me just put this, give me 1 second. So even now, for me, like the navigating Zoom, right, is another form of digital literacy. When I want to share my screen, but my Mac has 3 different screens, I must select the right one so that I can share the thing that I need to share with everyone, right? So that makes a big difference. If it's not in the right screen, I can't share it. So that in itself is a form of digital literacy, right? I need to know which screen to share. So if we think about cloud computing, this is an example of, you know, how we would, this is a digital literacy. So even though we have written text in a digital format. So this is my student, this is her weekly reading report. And then you can see we have the comments feature. And so I'm making different comments on her work, right? And then I'm interacting with what she has to say, and it gives me a timestamp, and it has my picture and my name, right? All of these features are part of a conversation. So even though I am not talking to her, we're having a means of digital communication in this cloud-based setting, right? And then we can go back in time. So you can see, you know, back on August 29, I responded to something that she said. You know, yes, this is a big deal in the field 25 years ago, and it resonates today in many ways. So we would want students to navigate what are the efficiencies of this, right? Now, I can download this and I can save a copy and all of these different features. Or let's say I lost something, I can go back in time. So I can look at the version history, and let's say I want to go back to like September 10. I can restore this vision, and it will be different from what I have now. It will even show the students' comments versus my comments, right? So if I'm working with students, I would need to teach them the different ways to enact with this cloud-based computing. It has different modes that give me different affordances, different good things and different challenging things, right? So it's a very effective way to communicate, but it's also, you know, it's one means of supporting them, okay? Discussion boards, right? Maybe you're teaching an online class and you want students to respond to the reading. And so you say to them, please post in the discussion board 2 responses to your classmates. So if you're using an online platform, what is the role of responding to someone in the discussion board? Can they know what post is the latest post? What post is the former post, right? This is very different than if you pick up a book or write in a journal. If you're writing in a journal, you might write top to bottom, left to right. If you're writing a discussion board, it threads the different parts by comment, by week, by poster. So they need to know how to navigate that. With ebooks, I'll never forget this. The first time I read an ebook, it ended. And I was so surprised because I didn't know the story would come to a close so quickly. When I'm reading a physical book, I can see, oh, there's only 2 or 5 or 10 pages left. But I wasn't paying attention to the progress bar. And so I got to the end of the book and I was like, oh my gosh, it's over. Like, because I lost the flipping of the pages, it was just digital. I didn't know the book was going to end, right? So that's an example of a different demand for a literate, like an ebook, right? Texting, we all text a lot. So the use of emojis, what do emojis mean? How do some emojis represent one thing versus a different thing, right? This is a different example of helping students if they're chatting, right? What about register? Can they say THX for thanks, right? Or should they write out things? Maybe something is humorous, and so they don't say, that made me laugh, right? They put LOL instead, right? Because that made me laugh is a lot to type, but LOL is not, right? Maybe they're very surprised by something. I am so surprised. No, they would often be like, OMG, right? Oh my goodness, right? So all of these are different literate features. They mean different things. And our students are already very adept at doing this, but we need to talk about, could I write a paper and put OMG, or is it bad to do that in a paper, right? So that's about register and pragmatics, right? Mobile applications, how to download mobile applications, how to delete mobile applications, how to transfer. If I do something in a mobile application, can I print it out on a printer? Can I send it to my friend, right? MP3 files. I want to download a podcast. It's an MP3 that I can save for later. All of these are different types of literate practices that we're often engaged in. But the demands to do these practices well differs very greatly based on the format, based on the mode. So all of those things are really important for us to be able to consider, right? Rss Aggregator, right? This is a feature that some web browsers have where you can curate the news that you want to see. So many of you are talking about information and disinformation and spreading of hate, right? So if you get caught up in only news from certain sites or only news from certain venues, then you're going to curate a view of the world that's different from other people. In my own country, in America, right now, we see this greatly. There are people who still think that COVID is a hoax. There are people that think the vaccines will have the government put computer chips into people, right? So all of these things are part of the social media that is really difficult. Okay, so someone is asking a question. I will try to come back to it. We're going to talk about critical media very soon. But all of these things take different tasks, right? And so also like with the TED Talk and all of these other things, we need to be mindful of how they can support our learning, but also how they can change our understandings, right? So if someone gives a TED Talk, right, we should know it's one idea in a short amount of time, and they'll go in for like 7 minutes. But a TED Talk is not going to give me a long history, right? So what is the role of a TED Talk versus reading a book chapter or reading a novel, right? These all things work in different ways, right? Again, I will get to your questions, but thank you for asking them, and we'll hopefully return to them. Okay, so then, we need to think about, and this zooms in. Let's say that we're looking at a traditional like paper in a journal versus something on a blog, right? So if we think about who is the audience, right? We're often thinking for writing, who am I writing for? Am I writing for my teacher? Is it for a grade? Is it for my friend? Is it for my colleague? An audience differs. Audience in school spaces or audience in a written paper differ from audience in online spaces. So tonight, the audience is you. Unless someone has this Zoom link and the password, they cannot join this session. So I designed this session for you. If I'm in France and I'm interested in digital literacies, I don't have access to this, right? So when we think about my audience is you. Now, if they said anyone in the world could have this Zoom link, then I would change the presentation to focus on a broader audience. But I know that my audience is Indonesian professionals. And so I want to direct my attention towards this audience. So when we think about blogging, if you're blogging, who is your audience? Is your audience other Muslim women? Is your audience other people who like the iPhone? Is your audience people who love animation, right? These different audiences will direct our attention for our blog, right? And the viewers who join will be based on the things that are attracted to them. So we have to think about, oh, someone put in here about tone. Yes. When we send an email or a text or even a blog, it's very difficult to know, are they sarcastic? What is the tone? Are they angry? Are they happy, right? My wife says, when I type email message, you sound very angry. And I'm like, no, I'm just very direct, right? I'm not angry, but it's just, this is how I am. So all of these things are things we must help our students to consider. How is tone on a blog different from tone in a written paper? What is the role of voice, my tone, my voice in my writing for a traditional like essay versus writing in tone for a blog? So all these are very different, right? Then second, we must consider, how can we synthesize information across multiple sources, right? Maybe a blog post is more on ideas. It doesn't have a whole bunch of references. We're not looking at other scholarly research. We're just looking at our ideas, right? And then also, if we want to evaluate the references for connections, right? So on my blog, I can put a hyperlink and it will take you to another idea. And that might have a hyperlink, take you to another idea. If I'm writing a traditional paper, if I want to get ideas, I have to look at the references list because the references will tell me where the ideas in the paper are. I can't click on the piece of paper and go to that journal article. I must take the article address and put it in the internet and then find the piece. But if I put something on my blog, I can hyperlink it so that people can connect to it, right? And then also, I need to think about what other media are there. What are the relevance of these additional images, right? So I can add GIF or I can add animation to my blog, but I cannot add animation to a traditional paper, right? So each of these formats has different ways to add information. And like I said earlier, every social media has, or every media has positive things that can help us and some hard things. Like I said before, if you take away, or if you add the audio, if you take away the video, or you add the video, all of these are different resources for learning. And when we think about digital literacies versus traditional literacies, they have different good things or bad things to support our expression and ideas. So another important consideration is around the idea of assessment. And so this comes from a scholar named Johnson, and she is saying these are important questions that we can be asking. So first of all, do students have access to these 21st century tools? In the United States, when the government shut down in March of 2020, many schools went online. But the biggest question was, not every family had a computer. Not every family had an internet connection at their home. So if we wanted to do online schooling in response to the pandemic, we had to consider, how do students get the devices that they need to learn? And then how do students get access to reliable internet so that they can have a connection and take these online lessons? If students do not have access to technology, either financial or material, then digital literacies will be very difficult for them because they will not have the resources they need in order to engage with the digital world. Second, do students have access to a range in depth and breadth of information? So as many of you have put in the chat, how can I know that my students are reading widely? How can I know that my students are not caught up in hateful websites or listening to the voices of people who do not share the ideas and values that are for the benefit of our community or for the benefit of our country? Are students able to read across languages? So maybe the student speaks 3 languages. A student who has French and English and Indonesian knowledge of language will be able to draw upon English and Indonesian and French sources. A student who maybe only speaks English can only get the news from English-based sources. And even though there are many English-based sources out in the world, their perspectives are still limited based on their linguistic ability. So maybe they don't get as much depth or as much breadth because they speak one language and not two or three. The next question we can ask ourselves is, do students have the capacity to use technology tools, right? Some students might be overwhelmed. Maybe they have certain learning disabilities, right? And so maybe the flashing lights on the computer are bad for their brain or their seeing. So they can't watch videos because they will have a seizure. Maybe the students don't know how to type something. So my daughter was in first grade when COVID happened. So she had to type out some responses, but it took her a long time because she had not been taught how to type. She could write, but typing was harder for her. So the capacity to engage was different. Maybe students are overwhelmed. You ask them to do research and they can go to the library and they're limited by the number of books in the library. But you send them to the internet to find research and they're overwhelmed because there's hundreds of thousands of sources. A library has many sources, but the knowledge of the library is contained to the books inside the library. The internet has all of these different sources, but maybe they're overwhelmed to know what is a good source or what is a bad source. Are students able to receive feedback from experts in the field? Maybe your students are training to be STEM professionals. Are they able to access other STEM professionals in online settings? Can they join a webinar? Can they email a professor? Like all of these things are access around these ideas and information. Sometimes students want to consider their audience, right? Maybe they want to be, in the US right now, people want to be famous, right? They want to be the influencer on social media. And they know if they can have a broad audience, maybe they can make some more money, right? Because many people can make money off the internet. So are students directing to a local audience? Are they speaking to broader audiences? So we know that the Muslim religion, Islamic faith, is a huge part of the Indonesian culture. So maybe a student in Indonesia wants to connect to the Muslim diaspora around the globe. They want to connect to Muslims in France and the US and Somalia and Iran. So the way that they're addressing their audience could be local or it could be global. And the choices that they make as they interact are determined by the audience they seek to address. Do students know what type of media is best effective, right? Maybe the student wants to record a webinar. Maybe the student wants to do a podcast. Maybe the student wants to make a TikTok video. Maybe the student wants to just tweet a whole Twitter thread with like 20 different embedded tweets, right? They should know what is the best way to get my message across, right? And different social media or different media have different ways to best communicate, right? So what would be the best mode to communicate my message? And then lastly is, because the internet has a lot of resource, can students engage in ethical behavior, right? So maybe the student wants to take two songs and put them together. They want to remix two songs, but they don't have permission from the artist to remix these songs. So maybe it would be unethical for them to steal this work and present it as their own, right? Licensing. If I want to show a video clip, do I need to ask permission, right? So do students also know how to engage in ways of using digital technology that won't get them in trouble from international copyright? Or maybe they're using something without permission and the person who produced this is upset that they've stolen their work. So all of these are important assessment considerations when we think about trying to work and trying to support students in their use of digital literacies. In the United States, we have a professional organization that is called the National Council for the Teaching of English. And so this is a professional organization that that sets digital sets an agenda. So you might have a professional organization in your context, and you would want to know, like, what are the best ways to design assessment or to have policy. And so for us, the National Council for the Teachers of English sets some of these ideas. So they said, in the US context, these are 5 ideas for 21st century literacy instruction. Can students develop proficiency and fluency with digital tools, right? That's a question we should ask. Are our students proficient? And then what does it mean to be proficient, right? Does it mean that they understand, like I said in the last slide, ethics? Does it mean that they can compose? Does it mean that they can respond? So all of these factors are considerations. And then can they share information with a variety of audiences? Can they analyze data from multiple sources? Can they evaluate multimedia text from different perspectives? Can they think about accuracy? Can they think about reliability? And then this is a big question, I think both in the US and also maybe abroad, is this notion of, can they, what does it mean to be a citizen? And I think our question here is, what does it mean to be a digital citizen in the broader community? What does it mean to share these ideas with people from my own country or people from around the world? And how do I engage in interactions with people that makes the most sense for what they're doing? So these are different policy-based recommendations. And you can kind of see, does the Ministry of Education in Indonesia advance a certain type of digital literacy skills? If so, what are those skills? What are the things that they're asking for? And how can your teaching address these recommendations from your policy-based organization? So all of these things are important considerations when we think about supporting our students. What are the policy-based implications? What are the ethical-based implications? What are the skills and techniques that they need to be able to effectively navigate these different things? All right. So now I'm going to model for you one of my own students' multimodal compositions. So when we think about multimodal composition, multi means many, and modes are the different forms. And this idea of multimodality and criticality, right? So you can just look at this image, and I want you to consider, what is this image suggesting, or what is this image saying about language? So if we look here, when we think about composition, we can see that this picture that the student has created is a visual image. There's 3 levels. There's the sky above, there's the surface of the water, and there's under the water. So this student made some design choices to show this scene. The fish below are observing the situation above. In the situation above, a man appears to be drowning, and he seems to be crying out, "Help me," in the French language. One man with binoculars looks upon the drowning man and asks his friend, "What do we do?" And his friend writes back, "Hope that a French boat comes by." This picture is somewhat disturbing. because the men in the boat have the capacity to help the man. They can see from his gestures, maybe, and from his shouting, from the tone of his voice, that he is in peril, that he's in trouble. Even if they do not understand French, they can clearly see that this man needs assistance. The fish below look up with concern, or at least one fish seems sad and the other seems like, what's going on here? And it says, it says a lot about the fish. The fish realize this is dehumanizing. They're not even humans, and they can see how awful this situation is. So when we think about this student and the composition, this student was able to make a variety of statements about the role of language and beliefs about language and how that impacts the way that humans interact with one another, right? Here, a man could drown because other people pretend that they don't speak his language, so they don't know what's going on. So if we think about this image here, this is what's being communicated. But if we think about the skills that are needed to make this image, the student had to understand language, differences across language, the role of language as a social feature, how fish can see the men's action as violent or as bad because they're not helping. So even though this is a pretty simple image that you could show to maybe a small child and they would understand this man is in trouble and these other men maybe aren't helping, there's a lot of complexity here in the choices that were made to compose this image. So for my students, I ask them often, please express your ideas visually. So this is an example of students communicating a very complex idea with only a few words. In the picture, all we have is help me in French. What do we do? A simple question and a response. Hope that a French boat comes by. So the language itself is not very demanding. It's very simple language, but the idea behind the language is very complex. So if we were just to judge the student on the 3 sentences that he wrote on a piece of paper, we would not think that the student had done a very good job. But because the student puts these 3 sentences with all of these other modes, they communicate a very complex idea. And it took a lot of thought to put this together, right? So the idea here is that multimodal composition can challenge students, it can allow for critical thinking, and it can be complex, even if the language and the language demands of the 3 sentences are very simple. Okay, so this is maybe the part that most of you are very interested in, is this idea of information overload. Because there is so much information in the world now through digital literacies and through just all the means and forms of communication, there is certainly the need for criticality. And that's kind of where I started my talk tonight. And we know that disinformation is a global phenomenon. It's not just happening in the US, it's not just happening in Europe or in Asia or in Oceania, it's happening all around the world. And so we definitely want to help students to be critical consumers of the different types of messages that they're reading. So I'm going to close out our time before we get to the question and answer tonight by just talking a little bit about critical media literacy, right? So I draw on the work of 3 different scholars who suggest that critical media literacy challenges students to analyze the codes and the conventions to confront issues of power or inequity or oppression, right? If we want to be whose voice is being advanced, whose voice is being silenced, who has the power to speak, who is disempowered or not given the power to speak, who is able to give a counter story, who is able to speak back to these narratives or to these ideas that they do not agree with or they do not appreciate, right? Also, we have to understand how does culture, how does economics, and how do political beliefs shape the messages that the media sends, right? So in the United States, where I'm from, during the election season, there's often all kinds of messages in the media, right? If you vote for this candidate, all of these bad things will happen. If you vote for this candidate, all of these bad things will happen. So we have to determine which is true, which is a lie, or what is maybe a little true and a little false, right? And what's the belief behind that? And then the other thing to consider is that this power is often shifting in digital worlds. So in the United States, for youth, for the youth culture, for young people, they don't like Facebook. They don't want to be on Facebook. In fact, they don't want to be on Instagram either. Young people today want to be on TikTok because TikTok is the best platform. It's the newest platform that youth are drawn to. For people that are in their 20s and 30s, Instagram is that. For people in their 50s and 60s, it's Facebook. So even though Facebook was so popular 15 years ago, it's fallen much out of favor. So the power now is on a new social media app. Now in 5 years, it might be a different app. And again, in America, TikTok is so popular. In Indonesia, maybe Facebook is still the most popular, or Twitter is the most popular. So these power shifts about messages are different in the digital worlds across the country and across the universe, right? So these things factor very, very differently in these contexts. So in the next slide, I'm going to share one heuristic that I think can help us to make sense of the different messages that the media sends. So this is the 5 A's of media literacy, and it is by a Greek scholar named Miletus. And he talks about there are 5 A's to media literacy: access, awareness, appreciation, assessment, and action. And each of these has smaller subcategories. So for example, if we want to assess a media source, who is the audience that this message is directed to? Is the message accurate? What is the purpose behind this message? If we think about a message that the media sends, who has access? Is it any person on the social media platform? Is it only people that are friends with me on the social media platform? What are the barriers to access? Is it financial? Is it physical? Is it environmental? Who gets to participate? Is this for all people? Is this for men? Is this for women? Is this for children? Is this for teens? Awareness. Whose ideologies, whose beliefs matter? Who gets to choose representation? What values are part of this process, right? And then for action, do people have voice and agency to make change? Are they part of communities that can draw different factors into this, right? So each of these factors would help us to assess media sources. So I'm going to share one story of a young woman that I came to learn with and from. Her name is Leah, and she was a student at a high school in Michigan where I did my dissertation study. Leah was from a family that originally had lived in Somalia, but moved to the United States because of some of the civil unrest in her country. So she is what some Americans would consider to be the daughter of refugees. Her parents left their country to come to America because of the instability in Somalia. Leah was the middle child. She was the 5th child, and there were 10 people in her family, and she was a high school junior. And I was asking her about her own use of social media. And we were talking after school one day, and she said, you know, I came across this podcast on Twitter, and the podcast was talking about how the hijab has been, or the scarf has been turned into a commodity. It's a way for corporations to make money. It's a way to objectify Muslim women as part of a broader consumer global market. And so she was sharing with me about this Huffington Post article that she had read. And she said, you know, some people think wearing a scarf is something that is oppressive, like, because in the US context, Sometimes people who are Islamophobic would suggest that, you know, women are made to wear the scarf. So she's already trying to tell a counter story to the US ideology around the scarf and what the scarf represents, you know, against us. And at the same time, they're making it something that is empowering and they want it everywhere. And she went on to say how the scarf is a part of a personal identification, a way of showing modesty. And for her, it was a personal choice. And so she was pushing back against these broader media narratives. She was engaging, she was engaging in a critical assessment of this article, right? Who is the audience? Well, it's marketers who want to use the hijab for financial gain. She was talking about the accuracy. Some people say it's oppressive, but in fact, that's not accurate at all. That's not what the scarf represents. That's a misguided notion. She was talking about awareness for values and ideologies. She knew that the hijab was a part of a Muslim female representation, and she wanted to bring broader awareness to other people that the wearing of the hijab is not about money, is about a personal religious identification, right? So all of these things that Leah did in her practices was sharing with me how she was speaking back to these broader media narratives. I also came to work with a young man named Albarco. He was also from Somalia and also identified as Muslim, and he's Black. And this was in the spring of 2017 when President Trump had just come into power in the US context. And President Trump signed an executive order that would ban travel to people from 6 predominantly Muslim countries, including Somalia, which is where Albarco was from. And so Albarco was seeing this trending topic on Twitter, and he wanted to give a counter story. He wanted to speak back to this narrative. He said, and he's talking about Trump. I don't know why Trump chose minority people. I'm a refugee, and like most refugees, I don't do a lot of this stuff. They think that refugees are bad people, but most refugees used to live in camps. They are lucky people like me who got to come and live here in the United States. So I don't know why this is the government and Trump and his administration, why they are saying that these guys are bad. Some people think that refugees are bad people and need to be checked before they come to the United States. But these are people who are themselves running away from bad people in their own countries, and they need safety. So Albarco was responding to a trending topic on Twitter to speak back to a negative framing of refugees in the US context, right? So we see from both of these young people who are Muslim identifying that they wanted to bring awareness and bring a counter story to some of these negative perceptions around the Islamic faith, around the hijab, and around people from Muslim countries who are entering into the United States as refugees. So I am very moved by the work of these 2 young people and what they did to speak back to disinformation or speak back to misinformation. And these youth were only 16 at the time. So when we think about young people, they have a lot of agency, they have a lot of ideas, and they can express these things to the world, to a global audience, to reshape the perspectives around criticality and critical media literacy. Okay, so as we close out, and I know we're going to go into a question and answer time, but I want you to consider for yourself, what did you learn from the presentation tonight? How did this build on what you already knew, right? So we think about schema, we have these ideas in our head. So what are new ideas that help us with new perspectives? And then how might you use these approaches in your future teaching? How can you apply the ideas we shared here to your future practice? So I thank you for listening so well. For those of you that nodded and smiled, thank you. It means a lot to me to see your encouraging feedback. So I guess now I will turn it back over for questions and answers.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. Yeah, so insightful information has been shared, yeah, by our guest lecturers today, and we are very grateful that he shared on current understanding of challenges in 21st century. Because yeah, globalization shaped in 21st century. Yeah, okay. So therefore, several ways have been informed about 21st century literacy practices. We are participating, and later we are going to design lesson plan that focus on the 21st century literacy skills. Okay, thank you very much. Now we are going to have question and answer session for about 35 minutes. And I'd like to invite 3 students to ask questions directly. But first, let me check the chat box. Yeah, I think we have some question there. Okay, so the first one from Perliana. Yeah, so how to manage our time to be able to read thousands of literature, maybe, when we have many works, many works and activities, so how we can manage our time, okay.
Yeah, so I think, you know, I will say this, one of the design features behind applications is to keep you engaged in the application. So you can scroll forever. It will never stop. It will just keep on, for a book, it's limited. So I think one thing is we can just be aware that online content wants our eyes on the screen for as long as possible because it's money, right? The more time I am, the more advertisements I can see, the more that I have to continue to, feed the algorithm that is curating the content that is making a lot of people money. So I think, maybe for you, sometimes like the phone, you can set a limit, like a timer. So you might say, only half an hour today on Twitter, no more than half an hour. Sometimes you can self-monitor. In the United States, they just released a study like recently that said that teenagers who are on Instagram feel worse about themselves. It gives them bad self-esteem because they get a lot of negative messages. They see other people that present a very good life and they think their life is very bad by comparison. So we know that too much time on these spaces can affect our mental well-being as well. In the case of doing research, I spend a lot of time online, but I stay on certain sites and not on other sites. So, maybe there's a site that you appreciate. So for me, it's the Google Scholar. So I can research in Google Scholar, and that will take me to journals and to databases, right? And so for me, like that's kind of a work-related use of the internet versus sometimes I also have Twitter open, and Twitter is like easier. The work is hard, and Twitter is a fun diversion. So we also should be mindful of like, am I doing this because I think it's fun? Or am I trying to avoid something, right? I'm resisting my work, so Twitter is easier, right? So I think being self-aware, they want you to stay on the app, they want to make money, and sometimes like being on this longer makes me feel worse, so I should just take a break.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. So we need to focus on our self-awareness, so which one is more important, Okay, thank you very much. We go to the second session from Rahma. So how to improve reading skills by using digital literacy provided online. Okay.
Yeah. So I think a number of different things. Sometimes, like if you go to a web page, it might have an audio file. So you can click and it will read you what is written. So this is a good way to reinforce the skills. If you encounter something that also has the audio file, then you can read and listen. For second language, it really helps a lot. Sometimes it will tell you how long it takes. So this article is 17,000 words, and it takes 25 minutes or 35 minutes to read this article. So sometimes these have already embedded supports. So maybe it will tell you how many words or how long you can expect to read the article. Maybe it will have the audio so you can listen and read at the same time. So I think also maybe you would say, this article has 10 hyperlinks inside, right? So maybe you'll say, I want to explore 5 of the hyperlinks, and it takes you back to like an earlier issue or something like that. So you can make choices for how you want to engage with it, but oftentimes it will tell you, these are the things, the supports that are in there, the audio, the time.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think it is suggested to read and also listen to the text. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, okay, so we have the next session here from Hasnan. So I think he says that we have different point of view between Western and Eastern media. So how can we react to this different point of view?
Mm-hmm. So I think it goes back to the assessment of sources, and questioning who benefits from me taking on this point of view, and who is maybe disadvantaged by me taking on this point of view. And I think, we also have to think about where are my own personal commitments. So if I, let's say I'm following a certain religious tradition, and someone is speaking out against my religious tradition, then, honestly, like I want to understand the criticisms or the critiques that someone is bringing, but so I can be informed. But I don't want to feel like I necessarily have to speak back to everything that I see online, right? So sometimes it's just being aware, like, how are the 2 or 3 or 5 sides framing the argument? And then which view do I most align with, and why do I align with that view? But ultimately, because we're individual people, people above us, the media has a lot more power to shape the message. And so I think we can just say, this is a perspective that I want to be aware of, but I don't want to engage it. Or these people up here are fighting, but I'm just a regular person. Like, we can let them fight up here, but like when I lived in China, often Chinese people were so kind to me, but they were like, your government. And I was like, I'm not my government. Like, I'm an American, but I'm not the American government. So sometimes it's the broader powers that fight it, but at the personal level, like, we're people. Like, we are not representative of these higher things. So sometimes we can just say, that's a matter that, like, the East versus West politicians can fight that out, but I'm not a politician, I'm a teacher.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. Yeah, so we focus on ourselves. Yeah, so we are teacher and we are not the politician. So maybe let it go. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we have another question from Anggi. Yeah, so how we can have a better understanding, yeah, for our literacy, yeah. Do we need to keep repeating, reading, or we need to move on another topic? Okay.
Yeah, so I think, digital literacy is here to stay. It's probably not going anywhere. So I do think, we'll get more practice. As new forms of literacy come in, we must learn how to engage with them. Like, even for us, when we switched in the pandemic to Zoom, so what's the proper etiquette for Zoom? Maybe you join muted, or you join with camera off, or you, like, when I was teaching last year online, many of my students had camera off. So then I trusted them. I was like, I know they're paying attention, but maybe they're just tired. They've been on the screen all day. They don't want people, like, when we normally talk to people, we interact with one another, but we don't have to see ourselves. On Zoom, you're always seeing yourself, right? So we have to learn these new tools, and that takes time. So I think sometimes repetition is helpful. At the same time, each platform does different things. So maybe if you want to improve your listening, you do a podcast. If you want to improve your speaking, you have a conversation. So I do think variety is good, and repetition is also good.
Okay, thank you very much. So repetition, yeah. So the keyword is on repetition and variety of platform that we use, yeah. So try to have a many platform as your media, yeah, to get your material. Okay. Thank you, Matthew. Anyone else? Okay. You may unmute yourself and ask the question directly. If you have question, please. Anyone? I think we still have about 20 minutes. Yeah. Okay. Anyone, please? More question? Okay. So we have a question from Isa on the chat box. Yeah. Okay. In Chinese. Okay. Okay, any suggestion how we can be fluent for our third language?
Yeah, right now the field of TESOL is in this multilingual turn. So there are scholars like Ophia Garcia and Li Wei who talk about translanguaging. And their understanding is that language is fluid across contexts, and they advance the idea of a repertoire. So I think when we think about language, not as like solitudes, like this is my English, or this is my Chinese, or this is my French, when we think about all of the language as part of a repertoire, then I do think that that helps us. As far as my teaching, I can empathize with my students because I know how hard it was to learn Chinese, and how sometimes, even though I think I'm a very hardworking and a little bit smart person, in Chinese, I often felt very stupid. I often felt like I cannot understand how to communicate. And it was nothing about my intelligence. It was just that I didn't have the vocabulary or the grammar. So I think when we're fluent across multiple languages, we have greater empathy for the challenges of learning a language. I would also say that language and culture are so closely connected. They're directly linked. So if you understand the language, you can understand the culture. And when you understand the culture, it can open up the ideas for why we think this, or why we feel this, or why we believe this, right? China often has many banquets, and the banquets are around a round table. So the table is a circle table. Normally, a circle table would suggest everyone is equal. But in Chinese culture, the most important person will sit opposite of the door. So if you're in a room with a door, they will sit facing the door, right? This is because of, many years ago, if an intruder came in the door, the person closest to the door could be harmed, killed quickly, right? But the person away from the door could see the intruder come in. So this is all part of the culture. And then, the person who sits to the right and to the left have different levels of power. So all of these things are cultural ideas that are tied up in the practices. And when you give a speech at a Chinese banquet, you should wait for the person across the table to give the toast first. And then his person on his right will give the toast. And then you will give a toast, right? So you learn all of these things in the language that's connected to the culture, but they're so connected. If you don't understand the language, you have no idea about the toasting and who speaks first and who speaks second. And so the more we understand fluency across languages, we also develop cultural competence to help us know how the language is used in the context of the culture.
Okay, thank you. So it is related to the culture, yeah. Okay, so
yes.
Hopefully by understanding the culture, it can help us for our teaching career, yeah. It also helps us to build our empathy, yeah, because about the difficulties of learning new language. Okay, thank you. Next question from Della, yeah. Can you recommend a website? Okay, website for international digital literacy learning. Okay.
There is I believe it's open access. There's the Journal of Media Literacy. And then also, it's not a website, but this is a book that just came out last week called The Handbook of Critical Literacies. And it is an international and global perspective. It's published by Routledge. And so maybe if your library is able to purchase it or your university is able to get digital access, the latter part, and again, this is the table of contents in the front of the book, right? But there's perspectives from all around the world: Singapore, South Africa, Caribbean islands, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Indonesia, right? So this book has a lot around critical literacy practices, and they talk about where has the field been, where is the field currently, and what challenges for the future. So this is a really good resource if you can obtain this through your university system.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, hopefully we can get the book later on. Okay, so we have another question from Malik. What should we do to improve teaching skill with digital literacy? Yeah. Okay.
So I think, yeah, I think the answer is maybe twofold. First, we should think about our own practices. So how am I engaging in digital literacy? What do I do to compose? Like in my day, is it sending an email? Is it sending a tweet? Is it podcasting? Is it posting a status update? Is it making an Instagram story? Is it recording a dance on TikTok, right? Then if I think about what I do, then I can think about, how is what I do inform my teaching, right? So one of the assignments that I have students do is I have them compose their own tweet, right? If we think about literacy, one of the things we want students to do is to have claims, evidence, and reason, right? I want to make a statement, that's my claim. I want to support it with evidence, have data, and then I want to have some sort of philosophy behind what I'm saying, right? So I can have students engage in tweets and say, you must write a 280-word, very brief something that takes a stance, that provides evidence, and that shows why you believe what you believe, right? So that's something I'm doing in my own practice, and then it's something that I carry over into my teaching. So students should be good at claim, evidence, and reason. So I have them do that through tweeting.
Okay, thank you very much, Malik. Yeah, does it answer your question? Okay, so we go to the another question. Yeah, Aulia. Maybe you can ask your question directly. You can unmute yourself. Aulia, are you here? No? Okay, so I think
it's okay. I can see that the question is about, how do we help the students to be critical? And so, I think, again, I would share this slide. I think if we want students to be critical, they should be asking some questions, right? So who benefits and who doesn't benefit? What are the cultural reasons behind this? What are the political reasons behind this? What are the economic reasons behind this, right? So if we think about, I'll just give the example from the US right now. In the US, we are still having like very bad COVID, right? Because some people choose not to get vaccinated. The Delta strain is very bad. Many people in the world would love to have the vaccination, but don't get the access, right? So when we think about the US alone, right? There's who benefits from people being sick, who benefits from people who are dying. And when we think about this, it's very sad, but the billionaires, the wealthiest people in the United States have made a lot of money in the pandemic, right? And so the people that are high, that are the captains of industry and the people that are owning these corporations, the pandemic has actually made them a whole lot richer. So maybe they want the pandemic to continue because they can make money off the pandemic. So if you follow the money, you will often find the reason behind it, right? So we can help our students to think about, these things. Who's going to benefit? Who loses out? What are the ties to this? Politically, who wins? Who has the power? Those are the things that can help us be more critical.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope it can answer Aulia's question. Okay, we go to the, next question. Someone speak with their own accent. Language that was using. I mean, if someone speak with their own accent. Okay.
Yeah. So here around accents, I want to speak to two ideas, and I want to say the field of TESOL is actually quite bad at this. Historically in TESOL, there was the idea of the native speaker, right? And the idealized speaker is like the native speaker. Many people in our field right now are pushing back against this idea, and they're saying, everyone has accented speech. We know that after the age of 7, our language fossilizes in a way. So if we're learning an additional language, we're going to have that accent. When I speak Chinese, I have an accent. There's nothing I can do about that. I will never be a Chinese native. I will never speak Chinese fluently like a Chinese person, and that's okay. Instead, we should focus on communicative competence. And that is the idea that we're able to understand each other, right? So the businessman from Singapore is getting together with the businessman from Bangladesh. Together, if they're both speaking English with an accent, but communicating, they're doing just fine. So I would challenge you to not worry about accent. As long as you're comprehensible, I think this is okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, the important thing is communicative competence. Yeah, as long as the speaker know each other, so it's okay, because different area will have different accent. Yeah, Singapore, we have word Englishes nowadays. Yeah, we have Singapore English, we have Korean English, and many more. Yeah, with different accent. Okay. Thank you. Maybe any more question? We still have about 10 minutes. Anyone, please? You can unmute yourself and ask the question directly. Anyone? Okay.
Hi, Bu Kaptia.
Yes, please, Bu Yulia.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, Matt. I would love to, how can I say, follow up your last remarks about that we must embrace the word Englishes, and that's interesting to me, meaning that in teaching my students about what English is, I have read some literature saying that we should give them ample exposure of this English variation. However, in the other side, I remember the SLA theories that when we give them that kind of unstandardized English, then it will somehow shape how they perceive the language in terms of the linguistic competence. So what do you think about this? When we give them a lot of exposure, it is good to introduce them to word Englishes, but at the second thought, we also need to pay attention to their linguistic competence to have at least standardized English. I would love to listen to your point of view about this. Thank you.
Sure, yes, thank you. This is a wonderful question. I mean, I really think the field of TESOL is greatly disrupted right now. People are very strongly pushing back against 30 years of SLA theory. So you have a lot of people on the two sides or the two camps. And I think ultimately this goes back to language ideologies and beliefs about language, right? So in the in the United States right now, the biggest question is around, what is standard English, right? And what people are saying is that standard English is often connected to whiteness, and it's often connected to class. So the middle class is the desired speech, right? And a lot of scholars are saying if that's the standard, why is it the standard, right? Is it the standard because these are the people that had the greatest access to education historically in the US, right? So scholars like Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa are talking a lot about ratiolinguistics. And they're saying, basically, when the listener hears someone speak, they're reading race onto them. And when they read race onto them, they're actually like discriminating against them. And so it's this idea that in the US, we have a very much a monolingual mindset. And I think that is the thing that our field is grappling with right now, because most of the world is bi or multilingual. But in the US, English is like the standard because English is the lingua franca, or it's the language that still has the most potential in the world. But I do think, we have to think about the idea of the global market, because often language is seen as a commodity, right? It's this idea that if I speak good English, I can get a good job, which is true in many contexts. But I think we also have to prepare students to realize that not everyone can work for Google or work for Twitter or Facebook, right? So this idea of the global market, it exists, but for most of our students, it's not something that they will attain, nor for many students is it something they want to go after, right? So I think we should lead with what are the goals of the student? And if the goal of the student is to get that job at Google, then we should do everything we can to support them to understand standardized English. But if their goal is to, interact in their community or interact with other people, then I think we can let go of some of these ideas, because I think ultimately it's a false standard to me. And again, I speak with a lot of privilege. I'm a native speaker of English and I'm white. So it's very easy for me to say, don't worry about standard, because I have what many people consider is the standard. But I do, when I talk to my own students, I want them to move away from these ideas. All language has the same potential. It's not like there's one language that does something different or better than another language. There's no language in the world where I can speak and I create things like I want $1 million and then $1 million comes to my hand. No language can do that. So all language has the same potential. We can help students to see that all language can be communicative and that we can make meaning together. So maybe it's not the response you want to hear, but it's really, I really want students to not be so caught up in someone else's ideal, but how do they want to use the language, and to what end do they want to use the language?
Thank you so much for the insights, Matt.
And just my perspective, only my idea.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I think we have our last question here. How can I improve my literacy skill without feeling anxious? Yeah, okay. When I see my friends have abilities far above me, okay, I think it relates to affective aspect, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I think we've long talked in the field about the affective filter, the sense of nervousness or the sense of sometimes shame. If we don't say the word right, we think people will laugh at us or people will look at us funny. I made so many mistakes when I was learning Chinese, and I think we have to give ourselves a lot of grace. one time, the word for short and electric in Chinese are very similar. The word is dian or duan. And my teacher was asking me something. I said, oh, it was that time that I was wearing my electric pants. And she looked at me and she said, what are electric pants? And I was like, oh, I was wearing my long pants. And then there was another time, this is actually very embarrassing, but in China, the winters are very cold. And so people often wear long underwear. They wear many layers under their clothes. But I was talking to her and I went to say, I'm not wearing long underwear today because it was a warm day, but I forgot the right word. And so I said, I'm not wearing any underwear. And I was so embarrassed. It was very shameful. But then I laughed and she laughed, and we realized it's part of learning a language is sometimes you just say silly things.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so it's okay to make mistake, yeah, because we are learning. Okay.
I made a lot of mistakes, a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, okay. We all make mistake, yeah, when we are learning. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much. I think this is the end of our question and answer session. Thank you very much. We have many insightful material from you. Okay. Hopefully, we learned a lot today, and then we will see you again, yeah, for the next schedule. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining our session today. For students, don't forget to fill out the exit ticket, yeah, for our English literacy class. Okay. Again, thank you Bapak Ibu untuk kehadirannya, and then thank you very much for Matthew for joining us today. Okay. Okay, so I think this is the end of our session. Oh, yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and Matthew. Goodbye.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for being such a good audience.